Thank you, everybody. So this is my first lecture in the series on process data in educational assessment. And on this lecture, I'm going to focus really on some of the big conceptual issues around what is process data and why is it important. So we'll look at some definitions of process data, the uses of process data, and in the other lectures, we'll dig deeper into the nature of multimodal process data. We'll discuss validity, the transition to digital assessments, issues around comparability and mode effects, and we'll also look at innovative next generation assessments. But for this lecture, I really want to focus on understanding what is response process data, how can we define it, and how do we use it? So that's going to be the focus for today's lecture. So what kind of area is this, assessment response processes? Well, it's a field of inquiry that brings together a number of disciplines, very often, and I think most effectively, in interdisciplinary research and studies of process data. So it combines disciplines such as psychology, cognitive science, psychometrics, linguistics, anthropology, a lot from computer science. And I'm sure there's some other fields there which I have not included, which are very much part of studying response processes. So it's kind of at the meeting place of many different disciplines. And so each discipline brings its own interesting insights and areas of expertise. And those discussions between the disciplines, I think, make for a very interesting field because a lot of it is about interdisciplinary discussions and comparisons of people's perspectives from different disciplines. Obviously, one of the key things there is the rise of computer science as, in a sense, a relatively latecomer in a way to the world of educational assessment, but it's now absolutely central to a lot of work on computer-based testing. So it includes areas, for example, around artificial intelligence, machine learning, the automated collection of analysis of data, learning analytics, human-computer interaction, computational psychometrics, human-computer and human avatar interaction. So there's now, people are not just interacting with the computer as an inanimate object, but the computer becomes an animated object, and sometimes that's done through avatars, but also in other ways. So computer science is becoming a very large area of inquiry and expertise around response processes, but it also includes these many other areas which I've put there. It's become very important in recent years because of the transition to digital modes of assessment. And so that includes issues around mode equivalence, but also the new affordances, the new potentials of computer-based testing, which are actually very extensive. And I think it's because of these new potentials that response processes has really become energized and expanded as a new field of inquiry. So when you look at the literature on response processes, it tends to say the same thing, which is that response processes are a old and neglected area of data in assessment. I want to start this workshop and this lecture with a different view. In my view, that's not accurate. In my view, response processes are actually a new field of inquiry. Now, I know that's somewhat controversial. I know that various people, for example, the work of Hubley and Zumbo and Newton and Bruchner and Pellegrino, if you read their work, it's on the references at the bottom of these slides. They will all tell you in their work that response processes are a neglected area. And to some extent, historically, they may be right. However, my feeling is that this is actually a new field of inquiry, and I want to study it as a new field of inquiry. So why do I argue that then? First of all, I think because of the transition to computer-based testing and to digital forms of data, we actually have, it's accelerated and expanded the study of process data quite significantly. So previously, before digital assessments, the study of response process was really using things like think aloud and cognitive interviews, interviews with test takers, essentially, as to provide insights into what's going on when people complete assessment tasks. But with the rise of computer science and computer-based testing, we see really big changes in the field. And if we look at the literature on response processes, what we see is a huge growth in publications in the testing community around response process data over the last, let's say, 5 years or so, a massive growth. And if we look at those, if we look at that literature, the literature really seems to focus on improvisation, innovation, experimentation. In other words, we're not dealing with routines here. We're not dealing with well-established protocols and procedures and standards. We're really dealing with a new field where researchers are pushing the boundaries of the field continuously. So most publications that you see on process data are trying to expand our understanding of the concepts, of the methodology. They're doing innovative work, and they're documenting that. So for me, that makes assessment response processes a very new, a very innovative, and a very exciting area of work on assessment. So I'm going to move now to talking a little bit about what we think response processes are and response process data is. Okay, so before we start then, we could ask the question, why process data? It seems like a reasonable question. Assessments produce test scores and products. We understand that that those that tests are produced with great care to think about the way that the construct is represented in the test. We know that experts will look at the potential sources of construct irrelevant variance, threats to the validity of a test, and that there's also a number of psychometric procedures that can be done to explore whether the test is performing as expected, you know, with diff analysis, etc. So there's a number of reasons why we might think that the test score or the product is a reliable, or should be a reliable, indicator of the performance of the participant in relation to a particular construct or trait that they're trying to measure. But as it says here in the quote from Ryans and Fredrickson, that's not always the case. Sometimes the product is not measurable apart from the performance. And Ryans and Fredrickson give the example of playing a musical instrument, where it's the quality of the way in which somebody participates in the task, which is revealing about their ability. And sometimes the performance and the product or the score is a useful way to capture somebody's abilities on a particular construct or trait. And more and more when we get into examining process data, we realize that that might be the case, particularly with certain kinds of tasks where the product or score in itself might not tell us everything we want to know about the assessment performance. As Erskine and Hay have argued, the final answers I'll just read this because there's quite a lot of text in the lecture, so I'll just read through it. Examinees' final answers to assessment tasks, the responses or products, may not provide information about what kind of response process the examinees engaged in to reach their responses. It may not be possible to determine whether examinees engaged with the tasks in the intended ways, and whether the different examinees took different solutions, strategies to produce the same responses. So there we get a number of questions emerging, both about the extent to which the test accurately captures the performance of the participant and the validity of the data. A number of different themes coming out, which we'll explore further. So I'm going to present now a couple of different models, ways to think about process data, and to some extent these are idealized models in that they don't represent a particular view of a particular author, but they're a way to think about the differences in the way that different researchers understand the role and contribution of response process data. So the first model I'm going to present is really a cognitive model, one that tries to capture mental operations. So when we see, for example, that we have a stimulus or task, and then we have an item score, one view is that response process data can tell us about what happens in that gap to explain how people respond to the item and get to their response to the product which is scored. And that in this model, it's viewed as a cognitive process. In other words, it's something that happens in someone's head in particular, and that it can help us to understand a little bit more about, for example, the construct representation. So how well is the task capturing and representing the construct that we're trying to explore? And there's some very influential work there in that field, in particular the work of Susan Embretson. I've cited there Embretson 2016, but her work goes back into at least until the early 80s, if not earlier. And a number of other people there, Bruckner and Pellegrino, Kane and Mislevy. Obviously, Mislevy's work on evidence-centered design is quite key there. But there's a number of other people who take this approach where we look at response processes as a kind of evidence around cognitive process or mental operations. But they're not the only way of thinking about response data. So this is my first definition I want to present. This is a definition from Erskine and Pellegrino. And they say response processes refer to the thought processes, strategies, approaches, and behaviors of examinees when they read, interpret, and formulate solutions to assessment tasks. So that's an interesting definition. And it's from their book on validation of score meaning for the next generation of assessments. Perhaps the key word there is meaning in the title of their book, validation of score meaning. It's interesting as a definition because although it starts with thought processes, it also goes on to talk about strategies and approaches and behaviors. So in a way, we begin to see in their definition the possibility that it might be something more than simply thought processes, that we might be dealing with, for example, behaviors which extend beyond cognition to other types of behavior that we might be able to explore when we try to understand responses. So that's the first definition. It's straightforward, it's quite short, it's quite workable, and it seems like a reasonable starting point. Let me go on to another definition. This one is by Hubley and Zumbo, and this is from their edited book on understanding and investigating response processes in validation research. And these two books, the one by Erskine and Pellegrino and the one by Zumbo and Hubley, are actually very nice source books if you want to study response processes. There's a lot of, in those edited books, there's a lot of very interesting chapters about various aspects of process data. So let me read through the definition by Hubley and Zumbo, and we can look at the difference between their definition and the definition by Erskine and Pellegrino. So here's theirs. One may think broadly of response processes as the mechanisms that underlie what people do, think, or feel when interacting with and responding to the item or task, and are responsible for generating observed score variation. So it's a little bit more wordy, a little bit more precise in some ways, and it's a bit more specified. But it's interesting there that it talks about what people do, think, or feel. So from that point of view, the sort of the ideas around cognition, which I described in this model I presented at the beginning, are expanded on because we've got what people do and think and feel. So we're dealing with not only cognitive, but also the affective aspects of assessment. It brings in issues around perhaps motivation, engagement, anxiety, etc. So it's an interesting definition, and this is one that I think personally I think is extremely useful, and I'll explain why as we go through the lecture. They note here that their definition expands response processes beyond the cognitive realm to include emotions, motivations, and behaviors. And that allows them to take into account how these may impact on the different respondents' interaction with the items, test, and testing situation. So again, they're including some really interesting points there. The inclusion of affect and motives, but also they look there at they include the test and the testing situation. So it's something about the ecology of the testing situation, which Bruno Zumbo in particular writes about in his work. So I think there we have a slightly expanded model. So it's not this the cognitive model of response processes that I presented initially. So this second model is one that I've developed here as a representation from the work of Zumbo and colleagues, where we have the initial testing situation, the stimulus and task, and the response processes. We have cognition and affect. So it's not just the cognitive processes, but also the affective processes. Obviously, that can be part of cognition. And they position those in relation to the testing situation. So there's a wider ecology which is beginning to take shape as we begin to investigate response processes. So in my diagram that I presented here, based on the work of Zumbo, we have a smaller circle, which I've put there with the blue outline, which is the testing situation. And I feel that's the immediate testing situation of the test taker. In other words, where they take the test, what's going on around them as they take the test. But as Zumbo and colleagues point out, very often we can understand the response processes, not just in relation to the testing situation in its narrow sense, but the wider test ecology. So that in their work, they talk about for example, the cultural and institutional context in which people take a test. And that may include things like the socioeconomic characteristics, the cultural linguistic characteristics of the test taker, which obviously expands way beyond the immediacy of initial testing situation to that wider test ecology. So it's a really interesting model, ecological model that they develop. And so I put the red oval there to include the broad context that they want to include in trying to understand and make sense of response processes. So already we're getting into quite a large and expanded and potentially quite a complex idea about the context of the testing situation and explanations for response processes. So I'm going to give some examples in a moment, but before I do, I want to tease out one or two interesting features of some of these definitions. The first one is the idea that response processes relate to something which is hidden. So this recent paper by Erskine, Go, and Hay, which is actually a 2020 paper. I seem to have missed the date on that, but it's 2020. They say even in digital assessments, cognitive responses themselves are not observable. What is captured in the Think Aloud protocols, as well as log files, need to be considered as traces of process rather than processes themselves. And in the definition by Hubley and Zumbo, we have a similar theme, because they say we may think broadly of response processes as the mechanisms that underlie what people think or do. So underlie what people do, think, or feel when interacting with and responding to the item or task. So in both those examples, we have the idea, which is paralleled in wider understanding around assessment and test scores or products, that the intended trait or ability always remains hidden, and that what we're actually able to capture is some evidence to make inferences about test scores and test processes. So that's a very interesting conceptual position that people take, that whenever we're capturing response process data, we're not actually capturing the response processes themselves, but rather we're capturing some data which we can use to make inferences. We can use to interpret and make meaning, as they say in the title of the Erskine and Pellegrino book. It's about interpretation of meaning of response data. So there's a distinction that we might make between response processes and response data that we can use to make inferences, and we can interpret and make judgments about what we think are going on. So there's a continuity there, I think, a conceptual and methodological continuity that connects up response process data and how we treat it and test scores. I think they all come under the same umbrella, where we are not actually able to directly observe them, but we can collect data and make inferences about them. And I think that's a really important point. The second point that I want to just make briefly is that when we collect response data, what we're doing is potentially revealing something. We're using technology to reveal something about response processes. And there I'm drawing on the philosophy of technology from the work of from Heidegger's work on philosophy of technology, where he talks about the way that technology can reveal something in the world. And while I just want to note that I don't agree with a lot of Heidegger's work, that's an important aspect, I think, an important contribution. The idea that technology reveals something. And the question I think we would have there is, what do the different techniques that we use for capturing response process data reveal about underlying response processes? And what are some of the challenges that we have in making those inferences in a valid way? So now I'm going to give an example before looking at how I would define response process data, at least. Now this example comes from my field work in Mongolia, where I studied the UNESCO Literacy Assessment and Monitoring Program, LAMP, which is a household-based study of literacy and numeracy of adults. I was invited by UNESCO Institute of Statistics to do research on the LAMP assessment as it took place in the main assessment in Mongolia. So I was studying, I was out of the lab, which is important to understand assessment in its own contexts. And this was the main assessment. So I'm looking at assessment in the wild and trying to understand how this might help us to understand the quality of data, the reliability and comparability of data, etc. So here's a couple of images just to set the scene. On the left, you can see a nomadic herder on the back of a horse. And he's actually giving us directions to get to where we were going, because in that area there were no roads and no road signs, and it relied on local knowledge to get from A to B. So there he is giving us directions to get to where we want to be. On the other side, we have a nomadic ger, which is like a yurt. It's that's the home of nomads in the Mongolian Gobi. They live in gers like this, very protected from the weather, from the cold and storms, etc. And this is their ger. So the data I'm going to present, response data I'm going to present, is collected in one of these gers during the LAMP assessment. And outside of the ger, you can see some interesting things there, including a solar charger, and a satellite dish obviously for TV, because you wouldn't live in the desert all the time without at least having television, obviously. Okay, so now I'm going to present some response data from this context. So here what we have is some recordings of interaction that took place in one of the LAMP assessments, and it's from my work on this topic, and there's a number of publications which you can see on the reading list, where you can find more information. So there's a number of people present in the testing situation, including me. I was observing and also recording what was going on. The respondent then begins by saying, "These graphics are confusing." So in this case, it's not a computer-based test, it's a paper-based test, and he's commenting that the graphics are confusing. And some visitors are arriving, and they're arriving because they wanted to look at horses that the test taker intended to sell. So already we have some quite interesting interactions. So we have a number of bystanders, people who are not supposed to be taking the test. They're not supposed to influence the test in any way. But as part of the wider testing ecology, they are present as bystanders. And one of the bystanders comes in and says, "It's getting dark." Now, clearly, his comment, "it's getting dark," is nothing to do with the fact that the graphics are confusing, but more the wider ecological testing situation, which is they were going to sell some horses, and the arrival of darkness implied something around the selling of horses. Then comes the test administrator, the tester. Number the answers to make them clear. And the respondent smiles and concentrates on the task. I can hear the movement of horses outside. Another visitor, a nomadic herder, comes in and pours himself some tea and lights a pipe. So it's beginning to be quite an interesting social situation. We've got the test taker, a number of bystanders, and the tester or administrator. Now the respondent again. "I'm just looking at this." So he's indicating to the visitors the test booklet as the focus of his activity. So what he's really saying is, we might be planning to sell horses this evening, but right now I'm taking a test. Then comes the tester. "If you think it's difficult, you can skip the question." But the respondent is really concentrating on the task. There's 3 herders now sitting watching the assessment event, and a 4th herder enters. And the 4th herder says, "The horses are coming in." The test taker is now multitasking. He says, "Okay, you go for the cows," because they have to collect the cows in as well as selling the horses. So the test taker is taking a test amongst this very interesting social situation. So there's a focal area of the test, including the respondent, the test items, and the test administrator. But you've got the wider test ecology, which is shaping the interactions at that time. Okay, so now what do we make from that? What do we make about that? So that's from a real testing situation. So as my colleague from UNESCO pointed out, this is not how the test was supposed to happen. When we model and when we teach about and train people about test administration, we don't say, well, in order to have a good test, you should have the respondent, the test taker, the test stimulus and questions, a number of different bystanders who might comment about things like pipes, make tea, and a number of horses and cattle outside. That's clearly not what people would expect when they're designing the administration of the test, but it's very much the real characteristics of a real test as it happened in this case in the Mongolian Gobi. So how do we begin to theorize that? Because clearly, if we're trying to understand test taking and response processes, we can't simply exclude data which is shaping potentially the response processes that we measure. So now I'm going to refine the definition, and my definition here is not simply looking at response processes, and as I've talked about earlier from the earlier definitions, those response processes to a certain extent remain hidden, and they're only to some extent revealed by the process data that we present, we collect, we present, we interpret. So my definition is going to focus not on the response processes, but on response process data. So here's my working definition, and I'll be interested to get your feedback and thoughts on it. Response process data support the valid and reliable interpretation and use of evidence on the cognitive and affective dimensions of test taking with respect to the temporal, situated, embodied, material, and interactive characteristics of test performance. So that's a little bit wordy, I'll admit, as a working definition. But I just want to point out a few things about it. The first of all is it's deliberately narrow in that my interest there is about the information that we can capture in the immediacy of the testing situation. It doesn't include the more distal, the more distant data that we might be able to capture around the features of group membership, for example, on people who are taking a test. So the early discussion, the wider ecological context that, for example, Bruno Zumbu describes about the socioeconomic characteristics and linguistic characteristics of the subgroup, for example, for taking a test, would not be included in this deliberately narrow view about response process data. Nor, I think, would we imagine that there should be any necessary logical or law-like coherence with the test construct and what some people have talked about, the nomological network, which I'll talk about in a future lecture. We're not necessarily expecting response process data to be coherent and reliable in relation to test constructs. And as I would say, as we'll talk about later in the lecture and in other lectures, this views response process data is inherently unruly and somewhat noisy. And that's challenging, but I think that's the nature of response process data. It's potentially unruly, it's potentially noisy, and one of the big tasks that people who work with response process data, one of the big tasks that they have to deal with is how to make meaning from that data. So there's a lot of work that goes in selection and cleaning and tidying and thinking, what data do we want to use? What data is valid and reliable? The second point I think I want to make about my working definition is I've put the validity and reliability of process data in the definition, because it seems clear to me that unless we can answer questions about the validity and reliability of process data, then we shouldn't be using it to make inferences about test performance. We need to think about how valid that data is and how we can validate it, how reliable it is for the different purposes that we want to use it for. Okay. So if we draw a diagram there, this is my third conceptual diagram then, about my particular working definition of response processes data, we see something like this. So in the red area, we have the testing situation, which involves the temporal, embodied, material, and interactive characteristics of the testing situation, which includes both cognition and affect. So it includes things like the cognitive processes, but also the affective processes. such as motivation or potentially distractions. And so those are features, I think, which should be key to response process data. In other words, they relate in particular to the immediacy of a testing situation. So the wider characteristics of the test-taking population, which are not part of the testing situation, I don't feel should be included in my working definition of response process data. That's not to say that it wouldn't be part of somebody else's definition, but in my own particular definition, I don't want to include it. So it's situated, it's temporal. In other words, it takes place at a moment in time. And often the significance in the interpretations that we make about response processes are about their temporal characteristics, about the time that people take on various things. And that might be response times on a particular item, or it might be wider characteristics about time. So for example, when I observed test taking in Slovenia in the OECD PIAC assessment, we noticed a number of different temporal characteristics of test taking, including the time of day when somebody takes a test. The time of day can really impact on the performance of test takers for a number of reasons. Some of those reasons are cognitive and physiological, and some of them relate to the wider context of the testing situation. For example, things like childcare and meal times, because those things can impact on test performance. We can expand that out even wider to look at things like seasonality. So in Slovenia, for example, we found that people's performance during the harvest season in Slovenia was diminished in comparison to the performance after and before the harvest season. Because during harvest, people's time was very valuable and they had less time to spend test taking, and they tended to rush the test taking. This is information from the administrators that given me. They said they felt that people were rushing the test more during the harvest season than they were outside the harvest season. So there's wider seasonality of impacts as well that we might look at. Now, clearly people are there as embodied people. So people's bodies are part of the test-taking processes. There are material artifacts which are part of it, whether it's a computer or paper or pen and paper that people use. And it's very often interactive in that we're dealing with interactions perhaps between test taker and administrator, or test takers interaction between the person and in some cases a computer, and in some cases that computer will be interacting in all sorts of dynamic ways. So I would place the wider test ecology outside this red area, but clearly it has an impact on those events which happen inside the testing situation. So if we look at the example of seasonality and the harvest season, that's happening outside the testing situation, but it's impacting on people's behavior in the testing situation. So that model then is a model that involves an extended, embodied, and action-oriented, environmentally coupled cognition. Let me unpack that a bit. So extended cognition extends the idea of cognition beyond the brain towards the embodied nature of cognition and the material artifacts that people might draw on as part of cognitive process. It's action-orientated in that it's task and action-orientated. The quote from the Herder said he was doing this particular, he explained to his colleagues he was doing this particular test. His focus was on the test taking, and it's environmentally coupled. As I'll talk about later in other lectures, the test environment has an impact on the testing situation and data that we can collect in that. So it's quite a different model of cognition than the earlier model that I presented in the first diagram. So just to conclude then, let's then think about not only what the definitions are of response data, but what the uses of response data are. And here I think we also need to do a bit of unpacking. And I've identified 4 different uses. A number of authors writing on response processes identify perhaps 2 or 3. and different uses of response process data. For the purposes of this lecture and the workshop, I've identified 4 of these, and I'll return to these uses of process data at various points during the workshop. So the first use that we might put it to is improving test and item design. So that would include things like observing cognitive and affective strategies. It can inform evidence-centered design, for example, the work of Ms. Levy and a number of colleagues there at ETS. It usually involves ideas around task decomposition. So we can break down tasks into the different components, and we can look at whether people are performing in the way that we expect. And that would be process model interpretation. In other words, we develop a model for what should be going on, and then we can explore whether the data confirms or refutes that model. And the work of Kane and Ms. Levy discusses that in their chapter in the book by Ersic and Pellegrino, 2017. We can also expand there on issues around user experience, item navigation, and mode effects, which are actually quite distinctive in computer-based testing. Now, I'll talk a bit more about user experience in the future lectures, but clearly user experience is a growing field that people are concerned about when they're designing computer-based tests. So how do people engage with how do users engage with the test item, with user interfaces, etc.? How do they navigate test items and platforms? These are distinctive features of computer-based design, which we've usually not been too concerned with in paper-based tests. In paper-based tests, of course, we think about how people are going to engage with the item. We might look at things like white space or the use of diagrams and how people are following the item in paper. But in computer-based tests, it becomes much more important. And response process data can tell us a lot about user experience, a lot about item navigation, and potentially on mode effects, and more widely on how people engage with the test and the test item. So that's the first of the uses, improving test and item design. The second use relates to validation practice. Now, there are validation aspects to all of these uses, but I think there's a particular set of validation practices which relate to test score interpretations in the sort of classic concerns around validity, which would include, for example, questions around construct representation and construct irrelevant variation. So these are 2 big themes from the work of Samuel Messick. Questions around evidence of fit, and how we might use observation explanation of response processes to inform those validity questions. So it's quite a distinctive concern with validation practice. And when you read quite a lot of the literature about response process data and response process, it seems to assume that we're talking about validation practice. Now, clearly, response process data can help a lot in our understanding of validation, but I wanted to point out here that there are a number of other uses of process data which are not primarily about validation. Of course, there will be some hardcore validation practitioners who would say everything is about validation and everything is about the construct validity, but I don't really support that view here. What I would like to argue is that there are different, quite distinct uses of process data, and it helps us to identify what those uses are. So a third use then is quality control or remote proctoring. Particularly, I think you'll notice with the COVID-19 situation and the shift towards computer-based tests and people taking the tests outside of testing centers, that there's a growing interest in remote proctoring and using various sources of data for that. So to detect unexpected variation, uneven test administration, cheating, threats to the quality of the test data. And in order to make sense of data from remote proctoring, we have to understand response processes and we have to understand test ecology. So data on remote proctoring is a form of process data, and it's subject to the very same questions that we'd have about any other form of process data or any other form of test performance data. We have to think about the test construct. We have to think about what we expect about the test ecology and about the response processes that we would expect to take place. And so we need to validate remote proctoring data, and we need to think about the types of data it's using and how we interpret and make sense of that data. And I think that's integral to a lot of remote proctoring work. For example, when people flag and identify particular behaviors in a testing situation, and then usually experts in the test, in some dimension of the test, will look at, does this behavior fit with what we regard as normal or acceptable behavior in the test? Or does it somehow represent a threat to the validity of the data? Okay, so the fourth and final one then, and a rather important one, is we use process data as an extension of the test. Now, this is really important, and this is one of the major changes in how we think about and use process data. So broadly speaking, then, we can look at test design and validation on one hand, and on the other hand, we have the idea that response process data itself can help us to support and extend claims about respondent ability and the variation in test scores that relates from that. So we're no longer using response process data simply for validation purposes and design purposes, but also to expand our understanding about test performance. Now that raises all sorts of really important issues about how we understand and collect and validate response process data. And in each of these four cases, we need to think about those questions. Each of those four cases, we need to validate our interpretation and use of that data for these different purposes.